Ever since we started grade school, we've all been told that we need a big, strong government to look after us. And that, sure, it may need fixing here and there, but generally today's government size is about right. We disagree. We think that government is a parasite, living off what you and I earn and using our money to do unpleasant things to us. From being a nation of self-reliant go-getters, America is fast becoming a country of government junkies. We think an alternative exists, one that puts you back in charge of your own life and destiny. We call it the freedom alternative.
Good evening. I'm Jim Davies, and welcome to our 40th consecutive weekly edition of The Freedom Alternative, the only program on television that shows that government is hooked on power and that many people, alas, are hooked on government. Today, as if to celebrate, we have a very special and fascinating show. We shall welcome two guests, Stephen Mendelsohn and Cathy Ludlum. They each have experience of a type of government savagery that is unfamiliar to most of us, including me. It's the practice of locking people up and mistreating them just because they behave in a strange manner. You probably know that in the 1930s, the government of Germany not only locked up those it judged mentally ill, it actually killed them, between 250,000 and 350,000 of them. Numbers unfortunately swamped by the even larger number slaughtered in the Jewish Holocaust a year or so later. What you may not know, as I did not, is that governmental mistreatment of the mentally ill is not just a fact of history in Germany, it's with us today in Connecticut. Our first guest is coordinator of the Legislative Coalition on Psychiatry and Human Rights and is a member of the board of the Connecticut Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. Steve Mendelsohn, thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to ask, first of all, how would you define mental illness? What is it?
Yes, there's complete confusion about what it is because, again, the whole field of psychiatry is very mystifying to a lot of people. Basically, the term and concept of mental illness are used to explain away behavior that we do not want to understand, and also to justify policies of coercing people who are innocent and excusing people who are guilty, which are totally inconsistent with the beliefs and practices of a free society.
Sounds like it's pretty hard to define then.
It basically is. A lot of people, psychiatrists especially lately, want people to believe that mental illness is synonymous with brain disease. And they claim that there are these scientific evidences which they cannot prove and which are totally refuted by textbooks on pathology, which do not list any of these so-called mental illnesses such as schizophrenia or manic depression as real diseases. It has nothing to do with real physical illness in spite of psychiatric propaganda. And most people deep in their hearts know this.
So there's nothing that the psychiatrists are able to measure, like in the case of physical illness, you can take your temperature, you know that you got a fever. Are you saying there's nothing corresponding to that in psychiatry?
It's basically a label used to demean people. It's nothing like that. It's basically like calling somebody a witch or a nigger or vermin in Nazi Germany. If you're capable of labeling a person as something less than fully human, you can stigmatize that person, lock them up, cart them away, and do all kinds of horrible things to people. People have been mistreating people since time immemorial.
My image, and I think you may be telling me that I'm wrong, but my image of this whole field has been that a person might feel upset, depressed, or something, and go to a psychiatric doctor and ask for treatment and get it and be cured. This may be a common view of the whole field. Is it about right, or are you saying that it's totally wrong?
It is a tiny minority of what goes on. And even that is skewed because many people go into the psychiatric system voluntarily, but they're not free to leave. What must be understood is...
Let me catch that again.
Yeah.
They're not free to leave even though they enter voluntarily?
Yes.
How does that happen?
if they can, what's called voluntary mental hospitalization is when you often sign what's called a 5-day paper, and then what they can hold you again, when you ask to be let go, they can hold you for 5 days before filing an involuntary commitment paper where they can lock you up. They can also, and many people, especially in the state hospital system, who are also on general hospital psychiatric wards, are brought in what's known as a physician's emergency certificate, where one psychiatrist can sign a certificate and lock you up for 15 days without habeas corpus, without any procedural due process rights.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, is this a commonplace thing that people go for treatment in good faith, as it were, and find themselves locked up against their will?
Actually, it's even worse than that, since roughly about a quarter to a half of all admissions, inpatient admissions, are involuntary to begin with, and especially, again, to the state hospital system. Furthermore, people can be coerced in the community. They don't even have to go to go in an institution. They can be ordered by courts. In Connecticut, it's largely persons through superior court because they've plea bargained, but and again, it can also happen anywhere in the prison system. Mm-hmm. But in 30 other states in this country, we have something called outpatient commitment. As if it was not bad enough to coerce people in institutions, you can now coerce them in the community. You know, people are not allowed to take relatively harmless marijuana, but they can be forced against their will to be injected with Thorazine, Prolixin, Haldol, and all other sorts of drugs which cause far more damage to the human brain, mind, personality, and soul.
Tell us then a little bit about this, the kind of treatment that somebody might receive once they have entered a psychiatric institution, perhaps voluntarily at first. What kinds of things can happen to them which they would not have expected, and do these treatments do them good or harm? Or what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, well, I can take a little bit from my own experience.
Yes,
I was locked up, sort of like tell it is as it is, like a child or teenager, because and children are among many groups of people who were less powerful in our society, who, in fact, probably the most powerless. You know, they're locked up in the schools, and they have no choice. You can't just leave school. It's a prison for children. And so I was very bright, but I also was picked on by the other kids. I was abused by a couple of teachers who fondled me in front of class, one who shouted, "Class, laugh," while fondling me. And I mean, I just eventually, I just could not take that kind of environment. Instead of changing the environment and making it more humane, what they do is blame it on the individual, make the human cog fit the social machine. First, they sent me to a social worker. I mean, it wasn't, and with children, everything is considered voluntary unless it's against the will of the child's parents. And eventually, what happened was that they gave me drugs, Mellaril, which knocked me out for 16 hours a day, Stelazine, which is also in the class of drugs called neuroleptics. These are the big, heavy psychiatric drugs used to snow people in the Soviet Union, except when they do it there, people here get upset. And I went, and my head was going like this.
Why did you do that?
I mean, that looks ugly.
Yes. Why did you do
Because
that?
the drugs made it impossible for me to control my movements. They caused disabilities like Parkinsonism, tardive dyskinesia, akathisia, restless legs, which I got from Naving when I was in the Institute of Living, which was after they couldn't, fix me on the outside. They sent me to the Institute of Living in Hartford, which is considered one of the nation's leading psychiatric facilities, private psychiatric facilities. And after a while, my parents, saw how bad it was, and they didn't want, I'm fairly lucky. I mean, there are people whose parents, who throw the book at their kids and use the psychiatrist to just control their kids because the child leads a different lifestyle.
But in your case?
In my case, I was lucky enough that my parents, in the end, allowed me to have the power to leave. And in a sense, I'm one of the few lucky people who was able to get out of the system after, getting in there. There are countless numbers of people who've been in institutions for 20, 30 years, who've been disabled by drugs, shock, even lobotomy years ago, insulin coma, and who are just totally institutionalized. And then after a while, when it gets too expensive for the state to keep them in, they're dumped. And that's why we have, at least a small part of our homeless problem is people who've been destroyed by psychiatry.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a revelation to me that you have been through this, I think you called it a psychiatric mill earlier, and you are convinced that the treatment you received made you appreciably worse. Is that correct?
And I wasn't treated for that long, and I wasn't treated on very high doses of the drugs. But I certainly was angry. I felt at one point, it's in my psychiatric records, that I felt I wanted to take my own life rather than be on those brain-damaging, body-crushing drugs.
Okay.
And the doctors said that that was a symptom of suicide and a further justification for locking me up or drugging me.
Sounds like a vicious circle.
It is. I mean,
you were lucky to get out of it, as you said.
there are countless people who haven't. Ernest Hemingway took his life after he was forcibly electroshocked. Occasionally it happens to famous people. Usually it happens to unknown people.
Yeah.
Powerful people in our society. President Bush is not likely to get locked up in a mental institution. The average poor person is much more likely to. If you're a member of a racial minority, women are twice as likely to get electroshocked as men. Older people are vulnerable, children, people with physical disabilities, people labeled mentally retarded.
Let's pass on to another subject. I know there's a tremendous field here that we could be discussing. You mentioned earlier that one of the ways you can get into this apparently vicious circle is that a court sends you there. And I know that you've written about quite a bit about the whole subject of lawyers using the defense in criminal cases of insanity. Tell us a little about this and whether you think it's a justified defense, or what's your opinion about it?
I think this is probably the most important issue in the field, that we cannot get rid of psychiatric violence until we do away with the insanity defense completely. And I think there are a number of reasons behind this. Number one, as people would very obviously, is that how many people out in the public consider mental patients to be violent and dangerous. It's precisely because we divert people out of the criminal justice system into the mental health system that all the innocent people, who are the vast majority of the people in the psychiatric system, are stigmatized as violent, dangerous maniacs.
You took, I was going to ask, you took the case in an article you wrote for the Hartford Courant of
David Peterson.
David Peterson. Say a little bit about that. Give us a thumbnail sketch of your article.
David Peterson is an example of the repeated failures of the insanity defense. Before he went out and escaped from Connecticut Valley Hospital, again, the whole idea of using hospitals as prisons and the whole misnomers and euphemisms here, he left basically unattended. And another thing is he was on the drugs at the time. That's important.
Okay.
He was on
what did he then
Loxetine.
do?
He went out and bought a hunting knife and brutally stabbed a 9-year-old girl to death in front of about 1,000 people in downtown Middletown at the local fair there.
This was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, after he'd been acquitted by reason of insanity of 2 other stabbings.
Yeah. That was before this.
Yeah, and that's why he was in the hospital, because he was not. He was not. And it's an example of the failure because he was not taught how to take responsibility for his actions.
Okay.
Instead of being told that he has to pay his debt to his victims and to society and to take responsibility for his behavior, he's told essentially that he's a victim of his biology or possibly of his environment, and told that he's not really a human being. In fact, Christopher James, who was his so-called public defender, wasn't really defending him, and labeled him a man-eating tiger, and said that he was about as responsible as a man-eating tiger.
You would say that was incorrect, that he was a responsible person.
Not only that, but by not holding him responsible, we turn such persons into less than fully human. It's labeling a person. By saying that the person is mentally ill and not fully responsible, we're saying that there's like witchcraft or vermin.
But many people would regard, I think I have regarded the insanity defense as a way for society to be softer on a person who has apparent mental problems
Yeah.
because he's not responsible for his actions. You took, in this article, the opposite view.
It's precisely the opposite. People, obviously, there are some times when psychiatrists can make a capricious decision and free a violent criminal. It happens. On average, however, the average person who is incarcerated as not guilty by reason of insanity is locked up for a longer period of time, and more so than that, is treated far more savagely than in prison.
This is fascinating.
Psychiatric facilities are, and especially places like Whiting, which are our special psychiatric hospitals, similar to the places where Soviets used to keep their dissidents, are far more brutal than prisons. In prisons, at least in theory, although again we now have psychiatric treatments invading the prison system, so the two institutions are becoming more and more alike, but at least in theory in prison you're not forced to undergo a personality change. In the psychiatric institutions you can have brain-disabling treatments, drugs, shock often.
Steve, our time is gone for this half of the program, but we really appreciate your opening up, certainly to me, and I hope to our audience, a really completely new vista of understanding on this.
I'm sure.
We're just going to rearrange the studio now so that Peter Verderosa can have a chat with our second guest, Cathy Ludlum.
And there's our little bit of video magic. Thank you, Jim and Steve. And here I am with Cathy Ludlum. Cathy, glad you could join us.
Thank you.
Say, have you been subject to some of the things that happened to Steve?
Nothing nearly as dramatic, but when I was 14, I was going through all those things that 14-year-old kids go through, and I didn't like myself very much or my world very much. And it's funny because when I went through later and looked at my medical records, it says I went through adolescent adjustment syndrome. So I guess anything that you do, you're subject to some kind of labeling.
A professional person titled it this particular diagnosis?
Yes, it's in my medical records.
That's incredible.
I thought it was just being 14.
I would think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the things that Jim and Steve were talking about were quite remarkable, and I'm sure that many of our listeners are giving them some deep thought. We here will no doubt go on giving a lot of thought to it in terms of freedom alternatives. Cathy, do you think that your disability, your particular disability, exemplifies your vulnerability?
Oh, I think it does, because if I had been anybody else and doing the things that I was doing and saying the things that I was saying, I would have been labeled as being 14. But because I also have a disability, it made me more likely to get more labels. And fortunately, I was never treated for that in any of the ways that Stephen had mentioned. But it does put you in a position of being more powerless than you would otherwise be.
So it is clear, as they made the point, that people who are politically powerful, shall we say, have preferential treatment and don't get into these situations where they become ruled, indoctrinated, and controlled.
Oh, I think that's very true.
What things have you been doing to try and help people who have become victimized in this regard?
Well, one way of reacting to this and making it better for people is to develop a circle of support. I've been involved with circles for almost 5 years now. And the first thing that happens in a circle of support is you give people back the right to dream, the right to have their own dreams.
Which often is something that is totally taken away because of the indoctrination, because you're told that you are imperfect, you are a defective person.
Right, and if you have a disability or something else happens to you, the first thing that happens is that you're told that you need to be on these programs, you can only earn this amount of money, you can only live in these specific places. And if it happens to you long enough, you feel like, why dream of anything else? Because it's very hard to break out of that. And what a circle does, when the circle facilitator comes into your life, they sit down with you and they don't say, we have these 6 options, which part of the machine do you think you can fit yourself into? Instead, they say, what do you want? Where do you want to live? What would you like to be doing? Where do you want to work? What would make you happy?
The kind of questions that would be asked of the people that our society has labeled normal.
Right, exactly right. And what happens next is that the person that the circle is about thinks about who they have in their life, parents, friends, neighbors, anyone that they're close to that they might like to have walk along with them in pursuit of these dreams.
Then I guess the whole view of friends and family changes because of it too.
It really does. It changes other people's perceptions about the person because you start to think of the person as having dreams and talents and gifts rather than thinking them always in a negative view. And it gives the person an opportunity also to give their talents and gifts to the members of their circle. It's very much a mutual relationship.
So the way that this applies, I see it very clearly with regard to the freedom alternative and what we talk about here each week, is that once again, it's the government that creates black-white issues, that creates handicapped, non-handicapped issues, that creates, brings the abortion issue into government. And so it's become very, very clear now, and you're helping to clarify that with all of this. And I think that, would I be right in saying that in circles, there are probably there's a lot more happiness there.
There's a lot more hope. I know a woman who was trying to get out of a nursing home, and the nursing home staff were throwing a fit and saying to the people in her circle, stop doing this, you're giving her false hope. And she wrote an essay called False Hope. And the point of her essay was, which would you rather have? False hope, which may not really be false after all, or no hope, which is what she had otherwise. And the other thing that I say often is if you have a big dream, really big dream, and you only get halfway there, that's still pretty far. But if you have a little tiny dream and you get all the way there, that's not far.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. I never heard it put that way before. I imagine that where that hope can be rekindled and reinstilled, anything is possible. Have you got some good success stories?
Oh yeah, lots of them.
Can you give me one, just for example?
How about me?
Great. Where do you think you were, and as relative to where you are now?
5 years ago, I was really trying to stay out of a nursing home. I live with my mom, and she's older, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she couldn't assist me anymore. And I really couldn't find an option that I thought where I could be both free, fits in well with your program, and safe at the same time, get the things that I need to thrive in my own life. And I really wanted to live in a housing cooperative. And as it happens, along with my circle, I've eventually found one. I've applied, I've been accepted, and I'm going through now the process that you go through to get ready to move into a housing co-op. And my tentative moving date is December 1st.
Wow.
It works.
What an
really
accomplishment,
works.
huh?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
And in fact, this will give you exposure to even more people, and you'll be spreading the word. It's sort of Cathy's ministry, if you will.
Well, sure, that's fine.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. When did you get together with Steve? How long have you known him?
I've been running into him on and off for about 2 or 3 years, I guess. And then about almost 2 years ago, we started running into each other more. And
from his first-hand experience and his obvious, very high level of intellectualism, shall we say, he has put together some shocking information.
Yes, he really has.
People should listen up and they should pay attention.
Yes.
What did you think at first? Was it hard to assimilate?
It was. Sometimes the things that he says are so shocking that you can't even take them in, and it takes a long time. And as we've gotten to be closer friends, it's helped me to really understand more of the things that he's talking about.
I see. Yeah. I can't help but wonder where it's going to end. It is through people like yourselves that we can educate others and have them see that, in fact, it may be to a great degree, a greater degree than people realize, that government, just as they have made, through their war on poverty, they've made poverty worse. It could be that through the kind of help that they claim to be offering handicapped people, people who have been determined by professionals, so-called professionals, to have mental illness, that perhaps they could only be making the situation worse.
That seems to often be the case.
And it seems to have something to do, too, with just sheer human spirit.
It does, and the thing that I'm rediscovering in my own life, and I think maybe Stephen is too, is that the richest and the best relationships and also support systems come from the community, just ordinary people, neighbors and friends.
Right.
And that if they can relate to you as a person and not as some kind of a label, they're going to be there for you.
It's these same people, unfortunately, that are being bombarded with media every day, and that media seems to be swaying them in the opposite direction, to think always of the collectivist ideal and always that we should look to the government for help, when really it's in them.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that I try to do in my own work, because I am a media person too, is to try and kind of turn that around and make it more individualized and person-centered, rather than always group-centered.
Cathy, if you had one final word here in our program as we bring it to a close, what would you like to say to people in your situation or with similar situation?
I would say never give up on your dreams. Share them with somebody, because when you share them with somebody, they may catch it and help you to get there.
That's beautiful. Cathy Ludlum, it's been great having you here, and I hope that things go well for you.
Thank you very much.
I don't see how they could possibly go otherwise, because you've got what it takes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now, let's wrap up the program by taking a look at what's been going on with regard to our state government, that is the state of Connecticut, the capital in Hartford. And of course, this is the 6th day of August, and the latest news is that the combined houses of the General Assembly have passed a tax package that excludes, I say excludes, a state income tax. And many of you feel very good about that. But the news on media and in the paper today shows you that the alternative package is going to weigh heavily on your pocketbook and on mine. It's very, very unfortunate. And it's clear that as we reflect, nobody has said anything about reduction in government size. It's something we want you to think about, and maybe, if you squawk enough, it's still possible. Join us again next week for another wonderful choice. It's called the Freedom Alternative. Good night, everybody.